Welcome to episode 5 of the Inside Elections podcast, where we analyze elections in a nonpartisan, data-driven, and accessible way. In this episode, who won 2 key special election primaries this week in Utah and Rhode Island? What and where are the most competitive races for governor this year and next year? And which congressional candidate has tickets to space? Buckle up. I'm Nathan Gonzales, and I spent Labor Day weekend just outside of D.C. in swimming pools in Maryland's 4th District and Virginia's 11th District.
Hey, I'm Erin, Covey, and I spent Labor Day weekend where I spend most of my weekends, which is in Virginia's 8th District, right on the border across the Potomac, which is represented by Don Beyer and is also where my boyfriend lives. So I cross the Potomac pretty much every weekend. But most of the weekend was actually in D.C., which obviously doesn't have congressional representation.
Still? No congressional representation? All right, Jacob.
And I'm Jacob Rubashkin, and I spent Labor Day weekend in New Jersey's 11th District, which is the New York suburbs, as well as Maryland's 7th District, which is the city of Baltimore.
Before we get to our 3 big stories, what are the big news developments that we should make sure not miss? Erin.
Yeah, so we had a redistricting development in Alabama. As a lot of y'all probably know, federal judges had previously struck down Alabama's congressional map and ordered them to draw a new map with 2 majority Black districts, or 2 districts that are very close to majority Black. The Alabama state legislatures did not do that. They drew a map that had 1 district that was majority Black and one that was like 40% Black. So really not anywhere close to a majority. So now it's going back to the courts, and the federal judges will appoint a special master who is supposed to present new maps by the end of this month. So the process is speeding up pretty quickly at this point, and we should have a better sense of what these districts look like soon. But ultimately, this is probably going to result in Democrats being able to take control of an extra seat in Alabama, which is obviously consequential when they have only 5 seats to flip in order to win a majority of the House in 2024.
Exactly. It's close. The fight is close. Jacob.
So Democrats got a top recruit in Virginia's 2nd District congressional race. Missy Cotter Smazel is a Navy veteran. She launched her bid against Republican Jen Kiggins today in this coastal Virginia seat that is one of the most competitive House districts in the nation. She is running against Republican Jen Kiggins, who herself narrowly ousted an incumbent Democrat Elaine Luria in 2022. Luria, of course, had defeated an incumbent Republican back in 2018. This district changes hands quite a bit. It's a very military-heavy seat. Cotter Smazel, former Navy officer, previously ran for state Senate in 2019, came up just short against her Republican opponent in that race, but is entering the 2024 contest with the support of much of the Democratic political establishment. She rolled out a long list of endorsements this morning, including most notably former Virginia Governor Ralph Northam.
And this morning being Wednesday morning, for those of you listening at different points. And to preview our next issue of Inside Elections is actually going to be our House overview, where we're going to update every competitive race around the country, including Virginia's 2nd District. For me, the don't miss it would be Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell. Unfortunately, had a second public health episode where he appeared to freeze at a press conference. This sparked new talk about whether McConnell will be finishing his term. There are some complicating factors that if he were to resign and there be an appointment, the Democratic governor, Andy Beshear, would make that appointment. But according to state law, he would need to pick 3 people of the same party but he could challenge that. He's up for re-election this year, which we'll talk about that race in a second. So there are a lot of moving parts, but new concern and talk about whether the Republican leader in the Senate there will be a change at the top. The Inside Elections podcast is sponsored by George Washington University's Graduate School of Political Management, or GSPM. The GSPM program offers master's degrees in campaign management and legislative affairs with in-person and online schedules designed for the working professional. The program is not just a sponsor, I'm also a graduate, and one of the benefits of the program are the other people in the program. I remember I had a classmate who said, I have a friend who's running for Congress. I think you should meet him. So I said, okay, TJ, who is he? And he said, well, he's a city councilman in Dublin in Northern California. He is running against a 20-term incumbent. And I'm like, okay, well, I guess I'll meet with him. And I'm glad that I did, because that candidate ended up being now Congressman Eric Swalwell of California. And so it's not just the classes, it's also the people. Click on the link for the GSPM program and see what it has to offer. Let's dive into our top 3 stories. First, we had 2 special elections 2,000 miles apart in Utah and Rhode Island.
My name is Gabe Amo, and I'm running for Congress.
Celeste Malloy, and I approve this message.
Becky Edwards, and she's the common sense conservative we need in Congress.
So, Jacob, these are both your states that you cover for us. What went down in these special elections?
Right. So there were 2 races that took place this past Tuesday that we were watching very closely. There was the Democratic primary in Rhode Island's 1st district. Congressman David Cicilline resigned earlier this year. There was a really crowded primary field vying to replace him. More than a dozen candidates, multiple controversies, candidates dropping out, candidates being accused of improper behavior. Ultimately, Gabe Amo, who's a former White House aide, ended up winning that primary with about 33% of the vote, getting about 9 points past the one of the front runners earlier in the race, former state representative Erin Regenberg. So Gabe Amo will most likely be the next member of Congress from this district. It's a very Democratic district, and Republicans aren't expected to seriously compete in the general election. On the other side of the country, in Utah's 2nd district, that's where Republican Chris Stewart resigned earlier this year as well. That was a slightly more compact primary, only 3 candidates there. And at the time that we're taping this podcast, that race still has not been called. It's actually neck and neck between Celeste Malloy, who was a former staffer for Congressman Stewart, and Becky Edwards, who is a former state representative in the Utah state legislature. Celeste Malloy currently at about 38%, Becky Edwards at about 36%. There is still votes outstanding, votes left to count, both in Celeste Malloy's home of Washington County and Becky Edwards' home of Salt Lake County. So depending on how many votes are left in each of those municipalities will determine who ultimately gets the nomination in this seat, a safe Republican seat that Democrats have a real candidate in, State Senator Kathleen Reeby, but are not expected to win this fall.
So let's talk about Rhode Island for a second, since we know more about it. And we should also note that the Vanessa Carlton and Barry Manilow candidates did not finish ahead. So that we've talked about that before, but we want to make sure we update our listeners. What type of member do we think Gabe Amo is going to be when he gets to Capitol Hill?
Well, he is squarely in the Bidenist faction of the Democratic Party. Former White House Chief of Staff Ron Klain, who had endorsed Amo, worked with him when Amo was in the White House at the beginning of the Biden presidency, called this race a win for Bidenism as the motivating force in the Democratic Party. So Gabe Amo tied himself very closely to the president. You know, I think he's not the most progressive member of the party. He's not a blue dog Democrat either. Like Biden, I think he'll try and triangulate himself pretty squarely in the middle and the mainstream of the Democratic Party if and when he gets to Congress later this year.
Well, it seems like he was also just trying to tie himself to the Kennedy family. And I'm curious, because there was that ad that played at the end with former Congressman Patrick Kennedy endorsing him. That seemed to be a motivating factor at the end of the race as he was gaining. But I'm curious how much of, I guess, his support was based on his connection to Biden specifically, or just to kind of like the Democratic establishment writ large, and the fact that he would be, a consistent Democratic vote and not too progressive or too moderate?
I think it all kind of plays into the same general vibe, right? He obviously, had that endorsement from Patrick Kennedy, who held this seat for a long time prior to David Cicilline, that he rolled out at the very end of the race, playing on kind of the Kennedy nostalgia that we know is still very much alive and well within the Democratic Party. He also put out an ad that was kind of a spoof of, or a riff on, the West Wing, talking about his own time working in not just the Biden White House, but actually as an aide in the Obama White House, even though he at that time was very junior, had just graduated college, and so showing that the connections to Obama and the ties to Obama are still relevant in a Democratic primary. Look, I think that is all kind of part of his appeal, right? He is both tied to the Democratic kind of leadership, but also he's a young guy. He's charismatic. He's got a great story. He's a local kid. And so, I think it's all of the above was the motivating forces behind his victory, as well as, of course, the fact that this race really was kind of a 9-car pileup. I mean, the number of front runners this race has would be surprising to anyone who was thinking about how it was going to play out earlier in the year. At the beginning, it looked like Lieutenant Governor Sabina Matos might just kind of walk away with this thing. And she ultimately placed fourth after a signature scandal regarding her petitions really just kind of put a hole in her campaign. The candidate who spent the most money on the race, Don Carlson, his bid was derailed by allegations of inappropriate behavior while he was a professor at Williams College. So a lot of things had to happen for Amo to capture that late momentum and get past Regenberg, who we always knew was going to claim about a quarter of the vote from the most progressive voters in the Democratic Party.
Yeah, because Regenberg had the event with Bernie Sanders right during the campaign. And we want to talk about Utah, but was there a lesson on the campaign side, a lesson to be learned from Gabe Abon winning? You talked about he wasn't the front runner coming into the race, so was there a secret sauce, or was it just that, hey, kind of slow and steady and let the other candidates torpedo their own campaigns?
Look, I think that it's a clear indicator that campaigns still matter, right? All of the polling that we had in this race, certainly on the earlier side, and granted, it was all coming from campaigns themselves, but none of those numbers showed Gabe Amo anywhere close to the share of the vote that he ultimately got. I think it's a testament to his campaign that he was able to build up that support over time. It's a lesson in peaking right at the right moment. I think, our colleague Daniela Altamari at Roll Call spent a lot of time with him in Rhode Island, going around knocking doors. He really ran a retail politics level campaign, in addition to, of course, cashing in on that connection to the many luminaries of the Democratic Party. He had support from the Congressional Black Caucus. So he really did kind of tie it all together. But the fact that his main opponents in the establishment lane all kind of crashed and burned was ultimately probably the most beneficial thing for him in order to get to where he needed to be. I mean, if you just look at the numbers, right? Sabina Matos, lieutenant governor, who at one point was polling as high as 30%, ended up with 8%. She 8% of the vote, right? If she had, gotten just a little bit more, if Don Carlson had stayed in the race and gotten just a little bit more, it's very easy to see how Regenberg's 25% goes from being a distant second place to being just enough to get over the finish line in first. And so, I think the overall lesson of this race is that campaigns matter, candidates matter, and things can change pretty quickly in a matter of months.
So as we shift to Utah, not knowing whether Malloy or Edwards will finish first and win the important Republican nomination in a Republican leaning seat. Does it would they be different members on Capitol Hill in terms of Malloy and Edwards? Are they different types of Republicans?
Yeah, look, I think that neither of them are kind of Freedom Caucus types. Neither of them are really out of the Trump wing of the party. But Becky Edwards has developed a reputation in her time as a state legislator, in her campaign against Senator Mike Lee, running in 2022 in the Republican Senate primary, as one of the most moderate Republican legislators in the state of Utah. And I think should she enter Congress, she would probably be one of, if not the most moderate Republican members of the House of Representatives. She was very anti-Trump in the 2020 election. She ultimately chalked up to voting for Biden in the 2020 race. And I think that would put her alone, certainly as as the only Republican member to openly admit to voting for Biden in 2020. There may be some others who would never admit that on camera. But that gives you kind of a sense of her politics. Sometimes she calls herself a conservative, sometimes she calls herself a moderate, but she is very focused on bipartisan compromise. Malloy, I think, comes from a more traditional wing of the Utah Republican Party. She came up through Congressman Stewart's office. Obviously, he has gotten closer to Trump in recent years, but is not certainly originally from the Trump faction of the party. He's a more established legislator. So, I think the notable thing here is that the candidate who aligned himself most with Trump was Bruce Huff. And he is in a distant third, is not going to win this seat. So, Utah Republicans showing themselves continuing to have a little bit more skepticism for the MAGA wing of the party than Republican primary voters in most other states.
And we should close the loop from last episode that Bruce Huff is the father of Julianne and Derek Huff of Dancing with the Stars. So I know some of you were waiting. You were unclear about that mystery. Jacob, there was also a regional difference in a very large district between the two candidates. Talk about that a little bit.
So Celeste Malloy comes from Washington County, which is in the southwest corner of the state. It is a much more rural county. The district extends all the way northward to take in some of Salt Lake County and Salt Lake City, obviously that largest metro area in the state of Utah. One of the real factors behind Malloy's rise as a credible candidate in this race was the desire from a lot of Republicans in this district to have representation off the Wasatch Front, off that central Utah region that includes Salt Lake City and Provo and some of the larger cities. There has not been in recent memory a representative in Utah in Congress from the area that Celeste Malloy is from. And so she has worked that angle very heavily. It helped her win the state's nominating convention. Becky Edwards is from Salt Lake. Bruce Huff is not from the rural part either. He's also from the Wasatch Front. And so Celeste Malloy has used that regional distinction to her advantage to marshal support. And as we look at the results, we see Becky Edwards putting up really strong numbers in Salt Lake County, really strong numbers in Davis County, which is right next door. And then Celeste Malloy really dominating in the more rural counties to the south and southwest.
Well, to end this part of the segment, I'm going to do a spontaneous trivia question. How many Rhode Island districts, how many Rhode Island first districts would fit into Utah's second district? Because the geography is, so if the first person to email me the answer to that question, Nathan@InsideElections.com, I will give you a 1-month complimentary subscription to the newsletter. So we're going to add some spice to this. But let's move on. Our second big topic is that our new ratings are out in the 2023-2024 races for governor.
I have walked in the very shoes of the people who struggle way more than they should in a state as blessed as this one. We can have a state government that fixes problems and delivers solutions.
So that was Jeff Landry, who is the Louisiana Attorney General and the likely successor to Governor John Bel Edwards. So Edwards is the only Democratic governor in the Deep South, but he's term limited this year, and it's becoming more and more likely that Republicans are going to take control of this seat.
So, Erin, tell us more about Jeff Landry, who looks like he's going to be the next governor of Louisiana.
Yeah, so Landry is an interesting character, as are a lot of the politicians who have come out of the state in recent years. He got his start as a police officer in the Acadiana region of the state. And he first made his foray into politics by running for state senate back in 2007. And then 3 years later, after being unsuccessful with that bid, he ran for Congress for an open seat in 2010, which he ended up winning kind of as the Tea Party conservative in the Republican primary. However, he was only in Congress for just one term, because right after that, he basically got redistricted out of his seat and had to run against an incumbent Republican congressman who defeated him in 2012. And then after leaving Congress, a couple of years later, he was elected to be Attorney General of Louisiana in 2015. Now, throughout his political career, he has dealt with a series of controversies, a couple of which have been around campaign finance ethics issues. He was reprimanded by the Louisiana Board of Ethics for using campaign funds to pay off a Suburban a couple of years ago. He also faced criticism for funneling his campaign money into a staffing company that he owns instead of paying campaign staff directly. And if he was paying campaign staff directly, you would be able to tell, obviously, how much he is paying his staff on the forms. But because it's all being funneled into a staffing company, it's not clear how much he is paying them. There are also some controversies around a firm that he and his brother owned, hiring undocumented immigrants. So he's faced kind of a series of ethics issues over the years. That has not stopped him, though, from becoming the front runner in the race to succeed Belle Edwards. And initially, this was going to be a much more competitive race, and Landry was potentially going to be running against some formidable opponents, including both of the state senators. Bill Cassidy considered running for governor, along with John Kennedy, along with the lieutenant governor. And one by one, all of these folks decided not to run. And because Landry had gotten a really early head start on fundraising and had gotten an early endorsement from the state Republican Party, he was really able to consolidate support. And by the time other Republicans who did not want him to be their next governor had kind of decided on an alternative candidate, it was a little bit too late. And so this is not going to be like the 2015 and 2019 races, most likely, where you had Republicans that were a lot more divided, and the race was a lot closer. And it seems like Landry is probably going to be the clear first place winner in the primary, which is in October. And then the Democrat on the ballot, Sean Wilson, will likely be the second place winner. And then the two will face each other in November.
Yeah. And if for those of you who want to know more about those stories about Landry that Erin was talking about, she has links to those to those stories in her story for Inside Elections, as well as the polling that shows that Landry is the clear front runner. We had that race initially rated as lean Republican, that it would be more. We thought it would be more competitive because of Edwards' track record. We recently moved it to likely Republican, which means we think Republicans, including Landry, have even a better chance of taking over that seat. But that's not the only race that's happening this year. There's also Mississippi and Kentucky. Jacob, maybe talk about Mississippi first, and what's happening there.
So in Mississippi, Republican Governor Tate Reeves is running for re-election. His Democratic opponent is Brandon Presley, who's a public service commissioner for the state's northern district. He comes from a small town called Nettleton in the state's kind of northeast corner, slightly by Tupelo, where Brandon Presley is much more famous. Second cousin made his name in the mid-20th century, but we moved this race from likely Republican to lean Republican to reflect an increased chance that Presley could pull off an upset. There are a number of factors that contributed to that decision. Reeves is dealing with the aftermath of a pretty widespread welfare scandal that plagued the previous administration of Governor Phil Bryant. Reeves was lieutenant governor at the time. He wasn't directly involved, but the Presley campaign has really been hammering him over and over about this scandal that has, caught up not just the former governor, but football legend Brett Favre and a number of other state officials, former state officials at the time as well. And so there's the kind of the cloud of scandal. There is the strengths that Presley himself brings to the table as kind of an old school Mississippi Democrat who might be able to claw back at least some of the conservative white voters who have left the party in droves over the last couple decades. He is proving to be a strong fundraiser on the national front, and he is working very hard to, strengthen his relationship with the Black community, Black voters obviously being the bedrock of the Democratic Party in Mississippi. There's been some mixed polling data out of this race. All of it shows Reeves in stronger position than Presley, but the thing that Presley has is a clearly defined path to victory, right? He knows exactly what he has to do in order to get to the 50% he needs to win. He needs to win a certain number of white voters, a certain number of Black voters, and get the electorate to a certain composition between Black voters and white voters. And if he does that, it's a tall task. It'll take a lot of money and effort, and it probably won't happen. But if he does it, he'll be the next governor of Mississippi.
Yeah, and maybe the premier race this year is in Kentucky, where we talked about Democratic Governor Andy Beshear is up for re-election. Kentucky, a very Republican state, but what are Republican chances of defeating the incumbent in that state?
It could still happen. We had this race rated as a toss-up. We moved it to tilt Democratic. That's our first category on the Democratic side of the ledger. What does that mean? It means that we see Andy Beshear, the incumbent Democratic governor, as the slight favorite. At the moment, he's got the stronger position, and we think that he's more likely than not going to maintain that position over the next 9 weeks until Election Day. What it doesn't mean is that he's a lock for re-election. What it doesn't mean is that Daniel Cameron, the Republican nominee, the state's attorney general, is dead in the water, not going to be able to win or anything like that. He could still win. Kentucky is a very Republican state. But if you look at the polling numbers, Beshear is consistently polling at around or just above 50%, which is what he needs to win. He's got significantly more money in the bank left to spend, and he's getting a lot of help from outside Democratic groups like the Democratic Governors Association, and he's very popular. His approval rating is somewhere in the high 50s or low 60s, and so he only has to win over voters who like the job he's doing as governor. He doesn't have to win over anyone who doesn't like how he's performing. You add all that up, you get a compelling case for Beshear at least being the slight favorite despite the state's intense Republican lean.
Yeah, and whenever Daniel Cameron's name comes up, it's usually heir apparent to Mitch McConnell, and that is relevant to what we were talking about earlier with Senator McConnell's health issues. And is he able to pull out this win over Beshear? And he ends up, and if McConnell steps down, does he end up making the appointment? Or, there are a lot of moving pieces in this process. In 2024, there aren't a ton of governorships, but there are two key toss-ups that we have: New Hampshire and North Carolina. Let's focus for this, for the time we have in this segment, on North Carolina. Erin, tell us kind of what's at stake in North Carolina next year.
Right. So in North Carolina, the Democratic governor, Roy Cooper, is term limited. And so this is teeing up to be probably one of the most competitive races in the country next year. Definitely Republicans' best pickup opportunity on the gubernatorial front. And right now it looks like the likely Republican nominee is Mark Robinson, who is the lieutenant governor. For those of y'all who follow North Carolina politics, you've probably heard his name. He's a pretty controversial figure and kind of has a long history of saying bigoted remarks that have already come up very early in this race and is sure to be a focal point of it. But he has won statewide before and has a lot of support from kind of the MAGA wing of the Republican Party, and this is going to be a competitive race regardless. And then on the Democratic side, you have Josh Stein, who is the Attorney General and the front runner for the Democratic nomination. He might face a primary opponent, but even with that, he is still the clear front runner. He's backed by Roy Cooper, who was also a former Attorney General, and is following a pretty well-worn path of Democratic attorneys general running for governor and being successful. So this is going to be a competitive race. We're starting it out as toss-up, but it's still very early. And once the primary is over and the general election ramps up, we'll have a better sense of how competitive it's going to be.
And North Carolina is going to be very consequential. You talked about the governor's race. At the presidential race, it's going to be a presidential battleground. Trump has won it twice, has won in the last two elections. And then redistricting. We're expecting a new map out of North Carolina where Republicans are likely to gain at least a couple of seats, but that is still in the process. Everyone can check out all of our governor's ratings online at InsideElections.com, and we'll be continuing to follow those throughout the cycle. But let's move on.
3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff.
And finally, California Democrat George Whitesides is headed to space. At least he has tickets to go to space. We found this from his personal financial disclosure form. Actually, Jacob, you found this in his personal financial disclosure form. How did you find this? And tell us more about the story.
Yeah, look, anyone can find these tidbits if you know where to look. Every candidate for the House of Representatives and for Senate has to file a personal financial disclosure form, and that's a form that they file with either the House clerk or the Senate clerk, detailing all of their income, all of their assets, if they've got positions on boards, things like that, in various forms. And it's always kind of interesting to look at the holdings and the financial positions of people running for Congress. People in Congress currently have to file them as well, of course. It's something I do, right? The database is always taking new disclosures, right? Depending on when candidates jump in the race is when they have to file these disclosures. So every couple of weeks, I tend to go and take a look and see who has filed their PFD. In the case of George Whitesides, he's running for Congress in California's 27th district, an LA County seat, currently represented by Republican Mike Garcia. It is one of the most Democratic districts held by a Republican. So Whitesides is trying to bring it back in line with the partisanship. Whitesides is, of course, a Democrat. He's also very wealthy. He's already put some of his own money into the campaign and has the capacity to spend more money. And so I'm always interested in just how wealthy candidates who say that they're going to self-fund are, how much financial power can they bring to this contest, and the PFDs give you a window, at least, into those finances. So frankly, George Whiteside's finances are uninteresting for the most part. He doesn't have any sort of zany investments. He's got a lot of money, but it's all in pretty reasonable investments. This is not an investment podcast, but I'm not a licensed financial advisor, but nothing really stood out there. But what did stand out is he listed holding 2 tickets for, quote, rocket-powered space flight. Now, the thing you have to know about George Whitesides is that he's the former CEO of Virgin Galactic, which is Richard Branson's spaceflight company. He's a former chief of staff at NASA under President Obama. And so he has a long history of involvement with the space industry. He has these tickets. I reached out to him after I saw them to ask whether he had a date already for when he was going up in space. And he said that he did not have a set time yet, but was looking forward to it whenever he got the opportunity. I believe he'll be on a Virgin Galactic flight, of course, his old company, but not sure whether that will be during the campaign or when he's a member of Congress. I think he would be the first member of Congress since Bill Nelson back in the 90s to go up to space.
Well, I'm curious, obviously being an astronaut, tends to help when you're running for Congress. I don't know if going to space, like as a private citizen, is as helpful. So I'll be curious to see when this happens and kind of how that affects his standing among voters or among his like potential constituents.
You know, he talks a lot about the space stuff, but mostly in terms of, you know, bringing jobs to the district. That the company had a lot of employees in district, and he talks just as much about his other venture, which is a firefighting venture, wildfire prevention organizations that he's stood up to help fight wildfires in California as well.
And one last thing about the personal financial disclosures. Some candidates or some current members intentionally handwrite them instead of typing them. I would argue, I think everyone on this podcast would argue to maybe conceal or make it difficult to figure out how much how much these candidates are worth. I don't know if that's, and I think that's a pet peeve, but that draws attention. I think if someone's handwriting them, then they often get more scrutiny. And finally, our last segment, Look What I Found. It doesn't have to be political. It could be sports, TV, pop culture. You never know what you're going to get. Jacob, what did you find?
So this is more of a look what I rediscovered as opposed to a look what I found. But I recently was in Bethesda, which is right by where I grew up, and stopped by Vace, which is an Italian deli and pizza shop that has a couple locations in DC. And, when I was in high school, I used to go there a lot for lunch, and I would always get the same thing. I would get a spicy soppressata sandwich with the works, with everything on it. And I had not had one in probably 10 years. And so I decided to order one on a whim, and it was just as delicious as I remember it. They do a really nice job there. It's a good shop, great food, good sandwiches, good pizza. So if you're in Bethesda, if you're in Cleveland Park, go to Vace.
I'm hungry.
Not sponsored. This isn't SponCon.
Not yet.
But Vace, if you're listening.
Erin, what'd you find?
So this is also pretty DC specific, although actually not. Depending on where you're living, you may live near an Alamo Drafthouse, which is a great chain of movie theaters that started in my home state of Texas. So I'm a little biased, but they're always showing a lot of throwback films. And I found out a couple of days ago that they were showing 2001: A Space Odyssey for one night only. It was last night. It kind of did overlap with results coming in, but I chose to sit in a movie theater rather than just refresh the New York Times page. And it was really incredible to see this film on the big screen where I think it was meant to be seen. It came out in 1968. And so it was wild thinking about what the experience of seeing this in a movie theater in 1968, when it was like really the front runner of all of these sci-fi space movies, was like. But yeah, if you live near an Alamo Drafthouse, I encourage you to check out their movie showings. They don't just show what's currently out, but they're always doing these throwbacks that are usually a lot cheaper than the regular movie tickets too.
And you still made it to the Twitter Spaces, so it all worked out. Now, and I found the Nateland podcast. It's not because my name happens to be Nathan. It's comedian Nate Bargatze and three other comedians sitting around a table talking about their lives. The last episode, they had a fast food bracket where they were ranking fast food chains, which is my speed. It's also clean. I admit that's my speed as well. It's kind of a palate cleanser, maybe after going through following politics as we do on a very specific level. So after you're done watching the entire Inside Elections library, podcast library, you might check out the Nateland podcast.
Our library of 5 podcasts.
Exactly. Actually, all of our episodes together might be as long as one of their episodes. It's a trip. It's a long journey, but it's fun as well. That's all the time we have. We learned about who might be coming to Congress after special elections in Utah and Rhode Island. We talked about the state of governor's races in this country, and we learned about the excitement and mystery of the congressional candidate who has tickets to space, all in the context of a competitive fight for the House and the Senate this election cycle. Thank you for joining us. At Inside Elections, we provide nonpartisan analysis of congressional, presidential, and gubernatorial races. With a combination of reporting and data, we break down the races and bring valuable context to those complex elections. Go to InsideElections.com to subscribe to the bi-weekly newsletter. We have individual subscriptions as well as group packages that are tailored to boost corporate and association PACs. If you like this episode, please subscribe on your favorite podcast platform and rate us. If you're watching us on YouTube, please push that thumbs up button. If you didn't like today's episode, please email Julianne Huff. We'd also want to thank our producers, Alan Tazinski and Melissa Lenner of Pretty Easy Podcasts, and our associate producer, Conrad Tolosa. Please come back and join us next time.